My name is Claire. I'm 59 years old, and the day my sister got married, I kept my mouth shut about the $17.3 million I had quietly inherited from our parents. And thank God I did, because 3 days later, everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, and even their deaths was shattered when they walked back into my house, alive, with a notary by their side and an envelope that would rip open every lie we'd ever lived with. It's funny, the things you remember from a day that changes your whole life. I remember the way the sun came through the stained glass windows at the little chapel Amanda rented for the wedding, turning everything gold and soft like a movie set, even though the air conditioning was broken and the pews were sticky with summer sweat. I remember how Amanda glided down the aisle in a dress far too white for her history, and how she waved at the guests like a queen returning to her throne. I remember the forced smiles, the hollow compliments, and how I sat in the back, 3 rows behind the family section, pretending that I belonged there, pretending that I wasn't carrying a secret bigger than anything I'd ever known, because no one knew. Not Amanda, not her groom, not even the people who were supposed to be resting 6 feet underground. No one knew that when our parents died, they had left behind everything: the house, the property, the bank accounts, the trust funds, the old family land in Vermont, the vintage cars Dad kept under tarps in a barn he never let anyone open. All of it to me. Not a penny to Amanda. Not a mention. Just me. And on that wedding day, I was supposed to act like none of it had ever happened. Amanda stood up during her toast, with her new diamond catching the light like it was trying to blind us, and said she wanted to thank everyone who had been there for her journey. And then she turned toward me, glass raised, and smiled that sweet little condescending smile she'd perfected since high school. She said, "And to my big sister Claire, thank you for always being there, even when no one asked you to be. Now that I'm settled, maybe you can finally start focusing on yourself. Take up knitting or something. You've earned it." The room laughed. Her husband chuckled. Someone clinked a glass, and I smiled. I smiled like it didn't slice me wide open, like I hadn't given up everything to take care of the parents who raised us both, while Amanda chased dreams and boyfriends and weekend getaways and somehow always landed on her feet. I clapped for her. I drank the champagne. I danced with the uncle no one remembered. I hugged her at the end of the night and told her she looked beautiful. And the entire time, I kept the weight of that secret right in the center of my chest, because I knew that if I said one word, just one, everything would explode. I could see it, like a movie already playing in my mind, her face crumbling, the guests whispering, the groom pulling away, Amanda turning on me like she always did when she didn't get what she wanted. And worst of all, the door that would open if she found out what I knew. The ugly, irreversible door that would invite something dark into both our lives. Because the truth is, Amanda wasn't just reckless. She was dangerous when she felt excluded, vindictive, and she'd go to war over a slice of pie, let alone millions of dollars in assets and legacy and power. So I swallowed it. All of it. The pain, the insult, the fear, the temptation to throw it in her face. I let her have her moment, because I thought that was the end of the story. That I'd walk away from that wedding and go back to my quiet little house, and the world would keep spinning just like it had after the funeral, just like it had after the will. But that wasn't the end. Not even close. What no one at that wedding knew, not the bridesmaids laughing by the cake table, not the pastor, not Amanda in her expensive shoes and perfect makeup, was that 6 months earlier, I had sat alone in a lawyer's office with a will in my lap that didn't just surprise me, it stunned me into silence. Our parents had made it clear. Everything they owned was mine. The house, the assets, the stocks, the properties, the family heirlooms, every single bit of it. And there was no note, no explanation, no letter of apology to Amanda, just a legal, notarized decision that cut her out completely. I hadn't spoken a word about it since. Not to her, not to anyone. I kept the papers in a fireproof box in my closet, the checkbook in the back of a drawer under my sweaters, and the truth in my throat every time Amanda called to brag about a new boyfriend or asked for advice she never followed. I told myself I was protecting her, that I was being the bigger person. But really, I was scared. Scared of what she'd do if she found out. Scared of what she'd take. Scared that even in death, our parents had handed me a burden instead of a gift. And then, 3 days after that wedding, 3 days after I watched Amanda twirl across a dance floor while I stood in the shadows, I opened my front door and nearly dropped dead from shock. Because standing on my porch, dressed in their usual clothes, hair combed and calm like they hadn't just faked their own deaths 6 months earlier, were my parents. My very much alive parents. With a notary and a suitcase and an envelope so thick I could feel the weight of it before it even hit my hands. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. I just stared at them like I was looking at ghosts. My mother tilted her head and smiled gently, like she'd come to drop off a casserole. My father nodded once and stepped inside like he still owned the place, which, technically, maybe he did. I heard the notary clear his throat and introduce himself, but I couldn't focus. My knees buckled. I had to sit down. My parents, alive, real, breathing, and acting like everything was normal. Like I hadn't lit candles at their memorial service. Like I hadn't cried alone in their bedroom. Like I hadn't spent the last half year mourning people who clearly hadn't mourned me at all. Dad opened the envelope, spread the papers across the table, and said we needed to talk. And all I could think, as the room tilted and the world I'd been living in cracked wide open, was thank God I hadn't said a word at that wedding. Thank God I'd stayed silent, because what came next would rewrite everything. When I finally found my voice again, it didn't come out in a shout or a cry. It came as a single, strained question that barely made it across the kitchen table. Why? My parents sat calmly across from me like they hadn't just climbed out of the grave and turned my entire reality upside down. And for a long moment, they just looked at me, as if deciding how much truth I could handle, or maybe trying to measure whether I still deserved the rest of the story. It was my father who finally spoke, steady as ever, with that cool authority he had always used whenever things got too emotional for my mother to bear. He said that after a series of health scares, his breathing episodes, her lapses in memory, the mounting realization that the end was coming sooner than they wanted to admit. They had decided they couldn't just leave everything to chance, especially not with how things had become between me and Amanda. They didn't trust words anymore, they said. They didn't trust promises. They wanted to see who we really were when no one was watching, when there was nothing to gain, and more importantly, nothing left to perform for. That was when they decided to vanish, at least temporarily. It had taken months of planning, legal maneuvering, favors from old colleagues and paid consultants, but they made it happen. The documents I'd seen were real, or real enough to fool me and everyone else. The cremation arrangements had been made using unclaimed identities, processed through a distant county. The hospice nurse had been a private caregiver under strict confidentiality, and even the neighbors were kept in the dark. What I thought were real ashes in those urns were someone else's altogether. And every memory I had of holding Mom's hand as she slipped away, or closing Dad's eyes in the quiet before dawn, those weren't just real to me. They were real experiences, just not with the people I thought they were. They had let stand-ins take their place while they watched from the edges, and all the while, they waited to see what we would do once they were gone. They saw that Amanda didn't come. They saw that she posted from beaches and brunches, that she called only once and never followed up, that she sent no flowers, made no appearances, showed no interest in responsibilities. They saw me pacing their halls at night, making lists, organizing paperwork, talking softly into the air like they could still hear me. They saw me clean their house room by room, even the attic and the old storm cellar. They saw the way I sat by the window with tea and silence. And they decided that was enough. enough to know who should carry the family forward, enough to know who could be trusted. That's when they drafted the will, the real one, not the one I'd already seen, and left everything to me. They said it wasn't about love, it wasn't about who they preferred, it was about responsibility, about memory, about continuity, about knowing that the things they had built wouldn't be turned into Airbnb listings or liquidated into luxury handbags. And they told me, with the same final tone Dad used to use at the dinner table when he ended a conversation, that the clause they added, the one that revoked the entire inheritance if I told Amanda about it, was necessary. They had to be sure I wouldn't try to fix anything, that I wouldn't, out of guilt or habit, offer her a piece of something she never earned, because they knew I would try. They knew me too well, and they were right. There were moments, especially in the first weeks, when I thought about calling Amanda and telling her everything, not because I thought she deserved it, but because I hated being the only one carrying the weight. I hated how it changed how I looked at her. Every time she called and chirped about her new yoga instructor or her latest cleanse or the wedding plans she couldn't afford but was somehow making happen, I wanted to scream. But instead, I nodded along. I asked about centerpieces. I offered to hem her veil. I smiled through her jabs. And when she said she hoped Mom and Dad were watching from heaven, I said nothing. My mother dabbed at her eyes when she told me that part had hurt the most, watching me carry it alone. But I didn't believe her. Not completely. If it had really hurt, they would have come back sooner. They would have spared me the panic attacks, the loneliness, the way I lay awake night after night with my stomach in knots, wondering if I was doing something terribly wrong by saying nothing. They had watched me suffer and decided it was worth it, for the bigger picture, for the family name, for their own private justice. I asked them what came next, whether Amanda would ever find out, whether they planned to reveal themselves to her too, or if she would go on thinking they were gone forever. My father said that depended on her behavior, on her choices, on whether she returned to the family with humility or just came sniffing for her share. He said they still hoped she might change, but he didn't look hopeful when he said it. And my mother just stared down at her hands like she wasn't sure she could handle that reunion, not after everything. And then they showed me the final set of documents, the legal transfer of everything, officially complete with every signature in place. All of it. The money, the land, the properties. It was mine now, no longer provisional, no longer contingent. The only caveat remained. I could never tell Amanda, not until the time came, and even then, only if they allowed it. I sat at that kitchen table for what felt like hours after they left, unable to move, unable to think. The sunlight had shifted by the time I finally stood, casting long shadows across the floor, and everything felt slightly off, like the room didn't quite belong to me anymore, like maybe nothing did. For so long, I had believed the inheritance was an unexpected mercy, a way to start over. A final thank you I hadn't asked for. But now, knowing the truth, it didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a trap I'd walked into with my eyes closed, and the only reason I was still standing was because I had stayed quiet, not out of strategy or strength, but simply because I was tired. I went to bed that night with the folders still on the kitchen table, the notary's card tucked into my purse, and the kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful at all. And I had no idea that within a week, Amanda would come knocking on my door with a smile on her face and something far more dangerous than suspicion in her eyes. I wasn't ready when Amanda showed up, though something in me must have known she would. It was barely a week after my parents reappeared, and I had just begun to breathe again, still waking each morning with the uneasy feeling that I'd dreamt it all. That I had imagined the quiet knock on the door, the way Dad spread out the documents like he was offering me the terms of a life I hadn't asked for, and the way Mom sat with her hands folded like this was all perfectly ordinary. I kept expecting a call, a letter, anything that would pull me back into reality, but instead there was only more silence, the kind that sits heavy across your shoulders and makes every creak in the house feel like someone whispering behind a door. I had just begun to accept that maybe nothing would happen for a while, that perhaps my parents meant what they said about waiting, observing, controlling the next steps. When I heard the sound of tires in the driveway and saw Amanda's car, far too clean for someone who claimed to be struggling financially, gliding up like it had every right to be there, she stepped out with that familiar expression. Part sweetness, part calculation. And the moment I saw the way she smoothed her dress and adjusted her hair in the side mirror before ringing the bell, I felt the old warning rise up in my chest like smoke before a fire. She didn't come in angry or suspicious, not yet anyway, but there was something off in her voice, too cheerful, too measured, as if she were tiptoeing around something she hadn't figured out how to ask directly. I noticed how her eyes darted around the room, taking mental inventory of everything, the furniture, the light fixture, even the old decorative plate on the hutch that Mom had always loved but never used. And I realized this wasn't a social call. It was reconnaissance. She asked about my health, about whether I was still volunteering at the community center, about if I'd been lonely since the wedding, all the while watching me closely like she expected to catch something slipping through the cracks in my face. I answered as evenly as I could, keeping my voice steady, my gestures slow, my smile calm but unreadable, and I could tell it frustrated her. The longer I gave her nothing, the more impatient she became, until finally she let the small talk drop and leaned in just a little, too close, her tone shifting in that quiet, careful way she always used when she was about to turn friendly curiosity into something sharp. She told me she'd heard something interesting, nothing specific, of course, just a comment someone made at the wedding about Mom and Dad's estate, how someone from the old neighborhood remembered a trust fund, how someone else thought they'd left behind more than what was publicized, and wasn't it odd how none of that ever seemed to surface? I listened, nodded politely, and kept my face blank, even though I could feel my pulse rising with every word. It wasn't just that she was fishing. It was that she already knew there was water in the well, and she was circling until she found the right place to drop the bucket. I said only what I had to, that I hadn't seen any trust paperwork beyond what the lawyer provided, that everything was handled months ago, and that, no, I hadn't received anything unexpected. I made it sound as ordinary as I could, and for a moment, I almost believed it had worked, until she asked if she could use the bathroom and disappeared down the hallway without waiting for an answer. I followed her, of course, keeping distance, pretending not to hover, but I could feel the tension coiling in my stomach as she lingered too long, opened the wrong door first, commented on the linen closet like it was a casual mistake, then finally stepped into the bathroom and locked it behind her with the faintest click that somehow echoed through the whole house. When she left 10 minutes later, I knew she had gone through something. A drawer, a file, maybe even that locked cabinet in the office I'd stupidly forgotten to check after the last time I moved the folders. She hugged me tighter than usual, gave that same sugary smile, and promised we'd talk soon. I watched her drive away with a pit forming in my gut, because the moment she left, I went straight to the cabinet, and sure enough, the arrangement of the folders was different. Not obvious, not careless, just enough to suggest a hand that wasn't mine had been there. One paper was slightly out of place, another had a faint thumbprint near the bottom where none had been before, and I knew without question that Amanda had seen just enough to feed her suspicions, even if she hadn't found the full truth yet. That night, I barely slept. I sat in the dark living room with only the kitchen light casting a glow across the floor, trying to piece together what I should do. I couldn't tell my parents, not yet. I didn't want to admit that I'd let Amanda get that close, that I hadn't thought to move the folders, that I'd underestimated how quickly she would shift from smiling sister to quiet investigator. But worse than that was the sickening realization that Amanda wasn't going to stop now. She'd tasted something, a scent on the wind, and once she caught it, she wouldn't let go. She never had. Whether it was high school roles, college internships, men, jobs, apartments, she had always gone after what she wanted, like it already belonged to her, the angle. And if it slipped through her fingers, she simply recalculated and went in from another angle. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. This was strategy. And for the first time since the funeral, I truly felt afraid. I thought I had more time. I thought I could stay 2 steps ahead if I kept my focus sharp and my behavior unshakably neutral. But Amanda moved faster than I expected, and it wasn't even a full week after her last visit when the phone call came from my parents. Not from their hidden number or the voice-masked line they'd been using since this whole twisted operation began, but from a real number, one that could be traced, one that could be heard through walls and passed along in whispers. It was my mother, calm on the surface, but with just enough hesitation in her voice to make me sit down before asking what was wrong. And when she told me that Amanda had shown up at their hideaway, the location they had told absolutely no one about, I felt something cold press against my ribs like a metal bar. She'd brought flowers, they said, and a pie from the old bakery on Main Street, and a carefully constructed explanation about how she just happened to be in the area and how she was feeling so nostalgic lately and had been dreaming about them and decided to visit the old family plot, even though it had taken her 6 months to fake a tear at the memorial. I couldn't breathe when I heard that. I could barely process how she had found them, or whether someone had talked, or if she had followed someone, or worse, if she had somehow guessed, if she had pieced together the inconsistencies, the small things that never quite added up, and taken a chance that happened to land exactly where she wanted it. My mother said they didn't let her inside, that they met her on the porch and kept the conversation vague, that my father stayed mostly silent while Amanda talked and kept circling back to the past, to the estate, to the will, to how she'd always wondered why things were so rushed, so quiet, and how strange it was that I never spoke much about what happened after the funeral, that maybe I was still grieving, or maybe I was just hiding something. She said Amanda never came out and accused me of anything, but the implication hung there like smoke, filling every pause in the conversation until my parents were left wondering how much she truly knew and how much she was bluffing. By the time the call ended, my heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing, thinking of every folder, every file, every moment that might have left a trail. I had been so careful, or at least I thought I had, but now it all felt like it was unraveling, like Amanda had her hands on the edge of the thread and was just waiting to yank. I barely slept that night, barely moved, barely breathed, and when morning came, I called the notary, the only person outside of my parents who knew everything, and told him I needed to review the security measures on all remaining documents because I no longer trusted that anything was out of reach. He agreed to meet me at the local library conference room later that afternoon. Neutral ground, quiet, safe, and I packed every important paper into a locked case and left the house without telling anyone. I arrived early, sat near the back where the walls felt close and the air was cool and quiet, and waited with my hands folded over the case like I was guarding treasure. And in a way I was, though it didn't feel like treasure anymore. It felt like a bomb waiting to detonate. The notary arrived on time, nodded once, and began laying out the protective filings, cross-referencing the digital copies, reassuring me that nothing had been accessed or altered. I started to relax, barely, just enough to feel like I might breathe again, and then the door creaked open, slowly, deliberately, and in walked Amanda. She stopped short when she saw me. I could see it. The flicker in her eyes, the quick recalibration, the way her lips parted as if she were about to pretend she had walked into the wrong room, but realized it would be pointless. I felt the blood drain from my face as I scrambled to casually close the case, sliding it off the table and down beside my chair like I had merely brought it along by habit, like it didn't contain every scrap of evidence that could unravel everything. Amanda said she was meeting someone about a community event, some donation effort she was hoping to lead, a transparent lie if I'd ever heard one, and asked if this was the library room B or C. The notary, God bless his stone-cold professionalism, stood up and said that we had this room reserved for a private review, that we would need a few more minutes. Amanda smiled too brightly and stepped back, pausing just a little too long at the door before turning and disappearing down the hallway, with that same irritating grace she had always used to exit a scene when she wanted people to watch her go. I didn't exhale until the door clicked shut. The notary looked at me and asked if she knew. I said I didn't think so, not fully, not yet. But she was getting close. I don't remember the rest of the meeting, not really, only that we re-secured everything, reviewed next steps, and agreed to relocate the originals to a safer location that even I wouldn't have access to without his signature. It felt like overkill, but I no longer believed anything was truly safe if Amanda decided she wanted it. Wanted. I drove home in a fog, gripping the wheel so tightly that my fingers cramped. And for the first time since this whole thing began, I seriously considered what it would mean to give up, to tell Amanda everything, to let the storm hit, to get it over with. But then I thought of my mother's face as she sat on my couch just days before, eyes soft but tired, and the way my father still believed in his plan, still believed that I had earned this, not just because I was the quiet one, but because I had done the work, carried the weight, and never once looked for applause. I thought of the way Amanda looked at me in that library, curious, hungry, almost impressed. And I knew I couldn't give in. Not now. Not when I had come this far. So I drove home, locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and sat in my living room with the TV flickering quietly and the case at my feet, knowing that for now, disaster had passed just inches from my skin, close enough to feel its heat, but hadn't broken through. Not yet. And I had no idea that the next time Amanda came to see me, she wouldn't be smiling. I felt it the moment I opened the door and saw Amanda standing there again, this time without her sugary smile, dressed too neatly for a casual visit, her nails perfectly polished, her hair freshly styled, and in her eyes that cold sharpness I remembered from our teenage years, the one that always appeared right before she did something reckless and cruel. She walked into my house like she owned it, her heels tapping across the floor in a slow, deliberate rhythm, and I understood before she even sat down that this wasn't a friendly call. This was a performance, a test, and maybe even a threat wrapped in soft tones and polite gestures. I let her sit in the chair by the window, the same one our mother used to favor, and I stood instead, leaning against the table, arms folded, waiting for her to reveal what she had really come for. She started talking about nothing at first. The weather, the wedding gifts she still needed to return, some vague plans about a future vacation she couldn't afford but was determined to book anyway. And I could feel every word pushing towards something, circling like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Then she shifted, almost imperceptibly, her voice lower, her gaze steadier, and she mentioned how unusual the will had been, how quickly everything was finalized, how strange it was that I never seemed worried about finances or the house, and how certain neighbors had commented that I seemed to be doing better than ever, as though life had gotten easier after our parents were gone. There was no anger in her tone, no accusation, just an undercurrent of suspicion so smooth it could almost pass for concern, and I realized she was baiting me, waiting for me to flinch. I didn't. I let her talk. Let her wander through her little web of implications. Let her act as though she wasn't trying to corner me. And when she finally stopped and tilted her head as if expecting me to fill the silence with some confession, I simply asked if she wanted tea. That small deflection irritated her. I could see it in the tightness of her jaw, but she smiled anyway, that practiced sweet smile that never reached her eyes. She stood up, wandered around the room like she was admiring the old photos, but I could see her scanning everything, the drawers, the shelves, the mail by the counter, as though she was searching for proof, something, anything, that would confirm the story she was building in her mind. When she stepped toward the hallway where my office was, I blocked the way with a casual but firm motion, pretending to straighten a picture frame. And she paused, only for a second, but it was enough. In that moment, I knew she was dangerously close to finding something that would ruin everything, and I felt my heartbeat slam against my ribs as I tried to keep my face neutral. It was then, when I was just about to make up some excuse to get her out of the house, that we both heard the sound. The soft thud of papers slipping inside the locked cabinet in the office, the one I thought was sealed tight but had apparently shifted when I moved the case earlier that morning. Amanda froze. My blood turned cold. I knew if she took one more step, if she asked the wrong question, if she so much as looked at me with that knowing smirk, it would all come undone. But then, as if fate decided to intervene, my phone rang, loud and sudden, breaking the tension like glass shattering. And I grabbed it like a lifeline. It was the notary, checking in to confirm that he had secured the originals at his office vault, and I latched onto the conversation as if it were an anchor, speaking with deliberate calm, while Amanda stood there watching me, trying to read something in my tone, but unable to make sense of it. By the time I ended the call, the moment had passed. She smiled again, said she needed to go, and walked out without another word, though I could feel the weight of her suspicion trailing behind her like a shadow. When the door closed, I stayed standing in the hallway for what felt like an hour, my hands trembling, my breath uneven, knowing how close it had all come to falling apart. One wrong sound, one wrong glance, and the secret would have spilled into her hands like broken glass. I locked the office, moved the remaining papers into a safe I'd hidden in the garage under an old stack of paint cans, and sat on the cold cement floor until my pulse steadied. I didn't know what Amanda's next move would be, but I knew she wouldn't let this go. She had smelled blood, and no matter how I tried to play calm and unbothered, she would keep circling until she either got what she wanted or destroyed everything trying. I told myself I had to be smarter, colder, quieter than ever before. And as I looked around my quiet house, I realized that silence had become both my shield and my prison. I had convinced myself that if I could just hold out long enough, if I could keep the truth buried beneath quiet routine and polite deflections, Amanda would eventually lose interest and move on to something shinier, something easier to take. But that hope vanished the day a letter arrived in an envelope too stiff, too formal, bearing my name in her delicate but cold handwriting, and when I opened it, the air in the room seemed to shift, like even the walls knew what was coming. Inside was a legal-style request, worded with forced politeness, asking for disclosure, suggesting that I had mishandled family assets, hinting that perhaps there had been confusion or mistakes during probate, and though it said nothing outright, it reeked of one thing: pressure. She wasn't knocking anymore. She was pushing her way in, using paperwork as a crowbar, and the worst part was that it almost worked. I felt the old tremble return to my hands, the one I used to get when I had to sign hospice documents or sit in cold offices with tired lawyers. And for one dizzying moment, I truly thought I might lose everything. I didn't call my parents. I didn't want them to see what Amanda was capable of when she really decided to sink her teeth in. And more than that, I didn't want them to question whether they had chosen the right daughter. So I handled it myself. I drafted a response, careful, formal, airtight, signed and dated and sealed in confidence, but the days after I sent it crawled with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. I barely slept. I ate toast for dinner 3 nights in a row. I started forgetting what day it was because every day felt the same, quiet, suffocating, fragile, until I got the second letter. This time, it wasn't Amanda's handwriting. It was from the clerk's office, an official notice that a motion had been filed and that Amanda had submitted a claim to contest the will on the basis of fraud. She had gone all in, and for a single horrible evening, I believed she might win. Not because she had proof, but because sometimes people like Amanda didn't need it. They just needed noise, confidence, and enough chaos to rattle the truth loose. I sat in the dark for hours that night, thinking maybe it was time to let it go, to walk away, to tell my parents that the silence had done its job, and I didn't want to fight anymore. But the next morning, before I could make that decision, the phone rang. It was my father. His voice was sharp, focused, steadier than I'd heard in weeks. And he asked me if I had seen the newspaper. Confused, I opened the local digital front page, and there it was. A community investigation into Amanda's charity work had uncovered a series of falsified expense reports, phantom projects, and missing donations that had been quietly swept under the rug for over a year, until one anonymous whistleblower had brought everything forward. I knew instantly it wasn't random. It was my mother. She had seen enough. She had pulled the right string, contacted the right person, handed over just enough truth to light the fire. Amanda had never seen it coming. Within 48 hours, her lawyer withdrew the claim. The contestation was dropped. And just like that, the threat she had built with such precision collapsed into dust. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I simply went out to my small backyard, sat in the same chair where I used to read to Mom under the oak tree, and let the air settle around me like a warm old blanket. I had survived. But the story wasn't finished yet, because just 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. No stamps, no return address, just an envelope slid through my front door like a whisper. Inside was Amanda's handwriting again, but different this time, smaller, softer. She said she knew everything now, that our parents were alive, that I had inherited it all, that she had figured it out during her last visit but hadn't had proof until the notary's car was spotted parked outside my house multiple times. She said she had known the truth, but still wanted to destroy me just to see if she could. But then she said something else. She said that losing was the best thing that had ever happened to her. Because when the news came out and the donations stopped, when the interviews dried up and the calls vanished and the checks bounced, she finally had to sit in the quiet and realize that she had never actually built anything of her own. It had always been borrowed charm, repackaged sweetness, and the illusion of virtue. And now that it was gone, she didn't know who she was. But for the first time in her life, she wanted to find out. I didn't know if I believed her. Part of me doubted she'd changed, but another part, the tired, aging, forgiving part of me, hoped she would. And just like that, I felt the weight finally lift, not because she apologized, not really, and not because I wanted to be sisters again, but because I realized I no longer needed to prove anything. I had passed the test long before I ever knew I was being tested. I had protected the truth without breaking under the weight of it, and now I could let it go. I didn't respond to Amanda's letter. I didn't need to. I simply opened a drawer, took out the old key to the cabin in Vermont, and packed a small bag. I left the papers behind. I left the bitterness, too. And I drove toward the quiet.